New cities are a type of startup. They let us try things that are new and different without forcing anybody to change what they're doing. When we do a startup, it's always an experiment. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they don't. The ones that don't succeed don't cost very much, so there's no harm in taking some risks, trying some experiments. The ones that do succeed, you copy and you replicate the things that are working. Countries often find it easy to designate a zone and to implement some new rules there. That can be done for two very distinct reasons. One is because you want to offer some concessions to particular firms you're trying to attract. This is not likely to turn out very well. On the other hand, you can use zones not as concession zones, but as reform zones, where you try out things that you might want to use in the rest of the country. And I think this is a very good way to test whether a policy is actually a concession or a reform. Ask, is this something we'd like to have last forever? And is this something that we'd like to have spread to the rest of the country? If the answer to both of those questions is yes, it's a reform. If it's not, it's probably a concession and probably not a good idea. The motivation, the inspiration for the idea of a reform zone is creating an opportunity for people to try something at large scale, a city, an entire city, with different rules, but to do that without any coercion. So this notion of a reform zone, I think, is very closely connected to the idea of a startup. And there's an interaction here that's very important. When you start a new firm, or you start a new zone or a new city, you have certain rules that say, this is how we're going to operate. So what a startup city or a startup firm does is attract a bunch of people who all believe in a different way of doing things. And it's that combination of new procedures that can make it possible for a startup to do something that would be very hard to persuade people to do in an existing organization. When we talk about human capital or talent in a firm, we often act as if there's a single measure of horsepower, and people with more horsepower are better, and that's the only thing to look for. But that really misses the important parts of social interaction. And so what you do in a startup is attract a group of people who believe in a certain way of operating, and that can create a culture, a corporate culture, that lets you do things together, lets you sustain cooperation in a way that you might not be able to do with a different kind of culture. In a time when billions of people are moving into cities, we have a chance to start some entirely new ones. That creates potential for reforms, experimentation that we won't have at other times in human history. But there will only be a few new startup cities, so most people moving into cities will move into existing cities. Our message to the leaders of those cities is you need to prepare for the expansion which is coming. I think New York is the most interesting city in the world, and it's interesting partly because it keeps changing. It's been very flexible. Should we be building more living space and increase the number of people living here? Should we just let the price increase and decide who gets to live in the scarce living space here based on their willingness to pay? Should the government make some effort to try and accommodate people who've traditionally lived here who are finding it hard to afford to pay the rent anymore? These are the big challenges New York is facing, but they're the challenges that reflect success, because it's a sign that many people want to live in this exciting place.